Hey guys, tonight we slip into the stiff shoes and starched collars of another age, the Victorian world. You wake up not in your own comfy bed with cotton sheets and a phone buzzing on the nightstand, but beneath heavy blankets, in a drafty room that smells faintly of coal smoke and candle wax. The window rattles against a foggy London morning. The truth is, you probably won't survive this without a little complaining, but complaining out loud isn't really allowed here. Not unless you want a lecture on gratitude and discipline before breakfast. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, I'd love to know. Drop your location and your local time in the comments. I want to see where and when you're tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Blank. Blank. You crack open your eyes, and the first thing you feel isn't freedom or curiosity, it's duty. Morning in a Victorian household means rules from the second your feet hit the cold wooden floor. You're expected to rise early, sometimes before dawn, depending on your rank in the family or your job. The idea of sleeping in is basically a crime against morality. Remember when you last hit the snooze button 3 times? That would earn you a reputation for laziness. And laziness is practically a sin. You wash up, though washing might just be splashing icy water from a jug into a porcelain basin. Soap is harsh, towels are scratchy, and hot water isn't guaranteed unless you're wealthy enough to pay a servant to heat it. And don't even think about showing up with bedhead. Hair is brushed and pinned neatly, shoes shined, nails scrubbed. A clean outward appearance is proof of an orderly inner soul. Or at least that's the propaganda of the day. Then comes the morning ritual of prayer or Bible reading. Religion isn't just personal here, it's social currency. Families that don't begin the day with a prayer are often whispered about, as though their lack of morning devotion might also lead to shady business deals or rebellious children. Historians still argue whether Victorians were genuinely devout or just obsessed with looking devout. Either way, you kneel, recite, and try not to yawn. Breakfast itself has its own mini-drama. But before you even get there, the household rules dominate. Servants in a wealthier home have already been up for hours, stoking fires and polishing silver. If you are the servant, well, congratulations. You're already sweating before the master of the house even rolls out of bed. One strict fact: punctuality is everything. A Victorian clock isn't just a machine on the mantle, it's a tyrant. Being late is more than inconvenient, it's a mark against your character. A missed bell, a late arrival to the table, and suddenly you're the subject of raised eyebrows and clipped remarks. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some families kept a household book of conduct. A literal written manual of how mornings should be carried out. Picture your mom leaving you a binder full of instructions like: rise promptly at 6, wash without complaint, speak politely at the table. Except instead of rolling your eyes, you're required to sign that you've read it, like a contract. As you trudge downstairs, every step has meaning. Children are supposed to walk softly, without stomping, and not chatter unless spoken to. Imagine trying to walk to the kitchen without dropping a sarcastic comment or complaining about the cold cereal, and then multiply that discipline by 10. That's the kind of silence expected here. The morning routine reinforces hierarchy too. Father, if present, always gets the best seat at the head of the table. Mother may orchestrate the order of the meal, but even she is bound by layers of etiquette. Younger siblings are taught to wait their turn, while older siblings must set the example. Everyone's role is so defined that sometimes it feels like you're living inside a stage play where forgetting your line means actual punishment. It's worth pausing here to picture the physical environment. Curtains heavy with soot, walls crowded with dark oil paintings, floors covered in patterned rugs that somehow never quite hide the drafts underneath. The fire in the hearth pops, but smoke lingers. The house smells of boiled cabbage, polish, and coal. Every sense is being trained, not for comfort, but for conformity. And here's a joke the Victorians probably wouldn't laugh at. Your modern morning coffee habit would be seen as an indulgence. Maybe even a weakness. Tea is acceptable. Coffee? That's a little foreign, a little too strong. And besides, it doesn't come with the same aura of British moral superiority. Good luck explaining your triple shot caramel latte to someone whose idea of indulgence is an extra spoonful of sugar. Servants, if you're in a wealthy household, operate almost invisibly. They rise earlier than you, set the table, polish your boots. But here's the kicker: you're not supposed to notice. To notice too much is to acknowledge their humanity. And Victorian etiquette quietly discourages that. Historians still argue whether households truly believed in this invisibility, or whether it was just a convenient way to avoid guilt. Finally, you settle at the table, still stiff from all the rules, your stomach rumbling. The morning has already tested your patience, and the day hasn't even begun. One wrong move, like spilling milk, or coughing without covering your mouth properly, and you're back under the microscope of improper upbringing. And let's be honest, the chances of making it through flawlessly are slim. But hey, you do get credit for one thing: you survived the first hour. Which, in a Victorian household, is a bigger victory than it sounds. Dressing is no casual affair here. You don't just throw on sweatpants and an oversized hoodie and call it good. In Victorian life, every morning is a costume change into a carefully coded language of fabric. Buttons, laces, and stays. Clothes don't just cover you, they announce who you are, what rank you hold, and whether you have any sense of respectability. For women, the ordeal begins with layers. First, a chemise, basically a long cotton underdress meant to keep sweat away from expensive fabrics. Then drawers, which are kind of like bloomers but split at the crotch for practical reasons, though. Spoiler, they're not really practical. Next, the corset. Oh, the corset. It's pulled tight with laces at the back until your waist is cinched into a shape society has decided is the definition of beauty. You breathe shallowly, your ribs compressed, and if you faint, well, at least you faint fashionably. Historians still argue whether women actually laced themselves to the point of damage or whether the most extreme examples were more myth than reality. Either way, you're not exactly jogging to the store in one of these. A joke for your trouble: the corset was the original waist trainer. Except instead of influencers selling it on Instagram, your mother and aunt are tightening it while giving you advice on marriage. Over the corset comes a petticoat, then maybe 2 more petticoats for volume, and finally a dress that might weigh as much as your weighted blanket at home. Skirts often brush the floor, meaning mud, soot, and the occasional rat tail from the streets come home with you. Gloves cover your hands, a bonnet hides your hair, and boots are laced up tight. Fashion is less about comfort and more about moral signaling. For men, the story is no less suffocating, though in different ways. You're expected to wear a stiff, high-collared shirt that scratches your neck, trousers pressed without a wrinkle, and a waistcoat layered under a jacket. Cravats and ties add the finishing touch. But don't get it wrong, the knot says something about your taste, your wealth, and whether you secretly wish you were a poet. Shoes must be polished so well you could check your teeth in them. One strict historical fact: laundresses worked endlessly because clothes were not just washed but boiled. Cleanliness wasn't only about hygiene, it was about proving discipline and respectability. A wrinkled shirt or stained dress suggested laziness, which in the Victorian code was nearly unforgivable. Here's the quirky tidbit: men's detachable collars and cuffs were invented so that you could change only the dirty parts of your shirt without having to wash the whole thing. Basically, the 19th century version of throwing on a fresh hoodie over yesterday's t-shirt. Except less comfy, and more cardboard stiff. The ritual of dressing also divides sharply along class lines. A middle-class woman might spend an hour each morning fussing with her outfit, while her maid struggles to keep up with tying laces and fastening hooks. A working-class woman? She throws on a simpler dress, maybe one petticoat if she can spare the fabric, and then it's straight to the factory or market. Same with men. Clerks in the city wear tailored suits, while coal miners head off in patched trousers and caps. Yet everyone, no matter how poor, is expected to aim for decency. Even the ragged shirt must be buttoned properly. Now picture yourself in summer. It's July. The air smells like horse manure and coal smoke, and you're wrapped in 3 layers of fabric that trap the heat like an oven. But taking any of it off in public? Absolutely scandalous. Sweat stains are a silent humiliation. In winter, meanwhile, you add cloaks, shawls, or fur-lined capes. which make you look dramatic but also weigh about as much as carrying a small dog on your shoulders all day. Clothes also regulate movement. Women can't stride or climb easily in their skirts. Men can't exactly lounge comfortably in stiff jackets. Even children are dressed as mini-adults, boys in sailor suits. Girls in frilly frocks, because childhood, as we understand it today, didn't really exist in the same carefree way. You're expected to perform maturity from the moment you can walk. And here's the irony: while you look polished, your body suffers. Doctors in the Victorian era debated whether corsets caused fainting spells, digestive issues, and even bent ribs. Some wrote pamphlets warning about corset disease, while others insisted it was all exaggerated. Historians still argue whether the dangers were universal or confined to the most extreme fashionistas. Either way, the phrase, "beauty is pain," definitely fits here. But don't think men had it easy. High collars were so stiff that some were nicknamed father killers. Why? Because leaning back suddenly in one could cut off circulation or even nick the jugular vein. Imagine explaining that on your death certificate. Cause of death, collar too fancy. Joke number 2 for tonight. If sweatpants had existed in the Victorian age, they would have been banned as a moral threat. Too much comfort clearly led straight to sin, or so they would have told you. The act of dressing is more than routine, it's surveillance. Families watch you, neighbors watch you, strangers watch you. Stepping outside in the wrong hat or with unpolished shoes could brand you as careless, immoral, or unworthy of advancement. Clothes are basically your daily resume. By the time you finish dressing, you're already exhausted. You've endured laces digging into your ribs, collars scratching your throat, and boots squeezing your toes. Yet, stepping out into the world, you must carry yourself with calm elegance, as if the entire ordeal was effortless. The illusion of grace is part of the performance. And so, corseted and collared, gloved and buttoned, you're finally ready to face the day. Just don't try bending over too quickly, or you'll learn firsthand why fainting couches were such a popular piece of furniture. Breakfast isn't just a meal, it's a test. You shuffle into the dining room, already aching from your corset or stiff collar, and sit where you're told. The table gleams with polished silver, embroidered napkins, and plates that mustn't clink too loudly when you set them down. Even porridge demands elegance. If you think cereal commercials make breakfast look formal, wait until you're expected to balance every gesture like you're in a finishing school exam. First rule: posture. You sit with your back straight, shoulders back, and arms tucked neatly at your sides. Slouching is the moral equivalent of confessing you have no ambition in life. Your spine becomes a soldier in the war for respectability. Elbows on the table? That's a crime so serious it might warrant a family intervention. Second rule: silence unless addressed. Children rarely speak at Victorian breakfast tables. Imagine trying to tell your parents about a funny dream you had, only to be shushed because it's improper to chatter before father has finished his toast. For kids, it's less, "good morning," and more, "good luck staying invisible." The food itself varies wildly by class. A working class family might eat bread, dripping, which is just fat saved from cooking meat, and weak tea. If you're wealthier, the table might groan with eggs, bacon, kippers, marmalade, and enough toast to build a small fort. In both cases, though, the food is secondary to the manners. You could be chewing dry crusts or savoring a full English spread. Either way, you're judged on how gracefully you handle the fork. Here's a strict historical fact: forks weren't always standard. By the early Victorian period, they became a mark of civilization, replacing the old habit of using knives and fingers. Holding a fork incorrectly, tines up instead of tines down, was enough to reveal you as unpolished. And heaven forbid you lick it clean. Now, a quirky tidbit: there were etiquette manuals that instructed families on how to butter bread in silence. Apparently, the sound of scraping butter across toast was considered vulgar in certain circles. Imagine being told you need to butter more, spiritually, as though your knife must glide without offense. Historians still argue whether these manuals were widely followed or just the obsession of the upper middle classes trying to imitate aristocracy. Some say ordinary Victorians weren't as uptight as the etiquette writers claimed. Others argue that even modest families tried to follow the rules to avoid embarrassment. Either way, when you sit down with your spoon, The weight of social expectation is heavier than the porridge. Children often got lessons mid-meal. A mother might quietly correct a daughter's wrist angle, or a father might glare at a son who dared gulp his milk. One wrong slurp and suddenly you're the star of a morality lecture before you've even had your tea. And the Victorians loved a good lecture, preferably before 9 a.m. Here's joke number 1 of this section. If you accidentally spill your tea at the Victorian table, you don't just get a napkin, you get a sermon on the dangers of moral decay. First spilled tea, next the collapse of society. Servants, if present, glide in and out like shadows, topping up cups or whisking away plates. You're not supposed to acknowledge them beyond the briefest nod. Talking directly to a servant in front of company? Far too intimate. It risks blurring the invisible social lines that keep everyone in their place. Conversation, when permitted, is an art form. Topics must be respectable, religion, politics, but only the kind everyone agrees on. The weather, and polite gossip. Nothing too crude, nothing too personal. If you think your family dinner arguments get tense, try debating industrial reform in a room where even coughing at the wrong moment earns a frown. Breakfast also sets the tone for the day. A household that eats in order, in silence, with perfect manners, proves to the world, and themselves, that they are moral, disciplined, and worthy of respect. A sloppy table, in contrast, might suggest chaos, poverty, or, worst of all, low character. Now, for a second joke, in a Victorian family, the real breakfast isn't bacon and eggs, it's judgment, served hot with a side of disapproval. Even the utensils themselves become symbolic. The right knife for fish, the right spoon for porridge, the right plate for jam. If you're wealthy, the array can feel overwhelming, like sitting down to eat with an IKEA instruction manual. And let's not forget tea. Always tea. It's poured carefully, not sloshed. Sugar cubes are handled with special tongs, not fingers. And milk goes in after the tea, unless, of course, you're in the camp that insists it should go in first. Historians still argue about this milk first debate, which sounds trivial but in practice separated the refined from the uncultured. By the time you finish, your stomach is filled, but your nerves are frayed. You've survived another examination in the endless classroom of Victorian manners, and you're only halfway through the morning. One last joke before we rise from the table. In today's world, table manners means remembering not to text while eating. In the Victorian world, texting would have been banned altogether, not because it's rude, but because the idea of sending a message without sealing it in wax would have been considered barbaric. You stand, carefully folding your napkin. Breakfast is over, but the rules linger. Every bite, every sip, every glance has been part of a social dance. And you, whether you wanted to or not, have performed your role. By now, you've had your first silent battle with toast etiquette, and you're laced so tightly into your clothes you can barely breathe. But the real weight pressing on you isn't the corset or the collar, it's the invisible script of gender. In Victorian homes, you don't just wake up and live, you wake up and perform according to what society has already decided you are. If you're born a boy, congratulations, you're already a future authority figure. The household may not treat you like a king just yet, but the path is being paved. You're supposed to be firm, self-controlled, and ambitious. Playtime often leans toward serious toys, wooden soldiers, building blocks, miniature books. You're being rehearsed for roles as lawyer, doctor, minister, or empire builder. Cry too loudly? You'll be scolded for weakness. Giggle too often? Someone mutters about you being unserious. If you're a girl, the script is even stricter. You're cast as the angel of the house, the guardian of morality, the delicate flower who must bloom in silence. Dolls, sewing kits, and little tea sets prepare you for a life of managing households, not leading armies. A girl running wild in the garden might be scolded back indoors, lest she scuff her dress or develop a suspicious streak of independence. Here's a strict fact. Victorians published countless conduct books specifically tailored to boys and girls. Titles like Advice to Young Ladies on Their Duties or The Boy's Own Guide to Virtue-Filled Shelves. They weren't fun reads, they were instruction manuals for life, spelling out exactly how you should speak, walk, pray, and even think. quirky tidbit? Some of these manuals actually gave tips on controlling facial expressions, because even looking too happy, too sad, or too curious at the wrong moment could mark you as ill-bred. Imagine living with your face policed. That random eyebrow twitch you just did? In Victorian terms, suspicious. Historians still argue whether these rules were genuinely internalized or whether people quietly rebelled behind closed doors. Some claim children became rigid adults because the scripts were so strict. Others suggest plenty of people laughed at the rules privately while pretending in public. The truth is likely both. The division of gender roles doesn't stop with children. Inside the home, fathers are the final authority. But mothers wield enormous influence too, though often behind the curtain. A mother is expected to embody purity and moral guidance, which means daughters grow up with constant reminders of how to be ladylike. No loud laughter, no roughhousing, no unchaperoned walks. Joke number 1. In a Victorian house, go to your room isn't a punishment, it's training for adulthood. Since you'll spend most of your life being told to stay there. For boys, even hobbies are gendered. Reading adventure stories is encouraged. But don't stray too far into frivolous novels. Physical activity like cricket or rowing? Great for toughening you up. For girls, though, running about too much risks being labeled unladylike. You're encouraged to read, but mostly poetry, moral essays, or novels deemed improving. In other words, nothing too spicy. And then comes behavior within the family. Boys are trained to lead, sisters to defer. If siblings argue, the girl is usually expected to yield first, because harmony is her duty. If you're a girl and you win an argument, that's not celebrated, it's suspicious. Here's joke number 2. If a Victorian boy is caught climbing a tree, people say he's adventurous. If a girl does it, people say she's scandalous. Same tree, totally different headline. Even adults are bound to gendered routines. Husbands manage finances, make business connections, and represent the family in public. Wives run the household economy, organize servants, and keep the family's social standing intact through hosting teas or attending visits. Neither job is easy, but they're presented as natural extensions of masculinity and femininity. And let's not forget expectations around emotions. Men are taught to master theirs, to appear calm and rational. Women, meanwhile, are expected to embody gentleness and sympathy, but never too much passion or anger. A woman shouting is seen as dangerous, a man shouting is seen as decisive. Historians still argue whether women truly embraced the angel of the house role or whether it was mostly a performance to survive in a rigid society. Diaries suggest plenty of women chafed at the limits, while others leaned into the role with pride. Either way, it set a tone that shaped entire households. Children absorb all of this before they can spell their names. You don't just learn to eat with a fork, you learn what's expected of you for the next 50 years. These daily rehearsals of gender roles carve grooves so deep that stepping outside them feels impossible. Here's joke number 3. In the Victorian world, boys will be boys, and girls will be blamed for it. By the time you've survived breakfast, you already feel the pressure of these invisible scripts. Whether you're being groomed for leadership or locked into domestic perfection, the rules never leave you alone. They're sewn into your clothes, whispered in your prayers, and reinforced with every glance from your parents. And as you push your chair back from the table, you can't help but feel it. Life here isn't just about what you do. It's about proving, every minute, that you are exactly what society thinks you should be. Lessons are next on the agenda. You've already managed to sit up straight at breakfast and survive the gender script rehearsal. But now comes the intellectual workout. Education in the Victorian world isn't just about learning facts, it's about shaping you into a respectable adult who knows their place. The classroom, whether it's a public school, private academy, or just your living room with a governess, is another theater for discipline. If you're from a wealthy or middle-class family, you're likely taught at home by a governess or sent to a boarding school. Lessons begin early, often with recitation of prayers or moral verses. Arithmetic, reading, and writing follow, but with an emphasis on penmanship so rigid it could double as calligraphy. It's not enough to spell correctly. You must form every letter as though angels are grading your loops and curls. A crooked G says as much about your character as your multiplication tables. Here's a strict fact. Victorian handwriting manuals weren't just guides. They were status symbols. A flowing copperplate script wasn't only elegant, it marked you as disciplined, educated, and employable. Bad handwriting, by contrast, was almost suspicious, as if sloppy letters might lead to sloppy morals. For boys, history lessons often focus on the glory of empire, maps shaded red for British colonies. Tales of explorers braving the unknown, usually lands already known by the people living there. And speeches about duty to the nation. Science is touched on too, but framed in ways that emphasize control and progress. You're being prepared to think of yourself as part of a conquering, civilizing machine. For girls, education leans toward accomplishments. Reading, music, drawing, embroidery, and French. Skills designed less for careers and more for marriage markets. A young woman who can play the piano gracefully is considered an ornament to the household, as valuable as the furniture. Joke number 1. In this world, your report card isn't just for your parents, it's basically your Tinder profile. Except your matches are filtered through your mother's friends at church. If you're poor, school may be a luxury. Many working-class children spend their mornings in factories or workshops instead of classrooms. The 1870 Education Act made basic schooling more widespread in Britain. But enforcement was uneven. You might go to a ragged school, named for the tattered clothes of its students. Lessons there are basic, reading scripture, a bit of arithmetic, and often crammed into overcrowded rooms. But even in these modest spaces, discipline is king. Discipline is, in fact, the heart of Victorian schooling. Teachers wield canes and rulers with confidence. A missed answer can mean knuckles wrapped or worse. The classroom atmosphere is not about creativity, it's about obedience. Speak out of turn, and you're punished. Daydream, and you're punished again. Joke number 2. In a Victorian classroom, even blinking too enthusiastically might be seen as rebellion. Quirky tidbit. Some schools used dunce caps, tall pointed hats meant to shame struggling students by making them stand in a corner. Imagine trying to learn your multiplication tables while everyone else snickers at your cone-shaped crown. Historians still argue whether the dunce cap was as common as caricatures suggest, or more of an occasional humiliation that later became exaggerated in memory. Lessons often include recitation. You stand, hands behind your back, and repeat lines of Latin, Bible verses, or moral proverbs in unison with your classmates. The sound fills the air like a strange chant, more about rhythm and control than real comprehension. If you stumble, your cheeks burn as the teacher's eyes lock on you. Afternoons might shift to practical lessons. Boys tackle geometry or Latin grammar, while girls sew samplers, embroidered cloths displaying alphabets or proverbs. Proof they can stitch as neatly as they can recite. The sampler, framed on the wall, becomes both a record of education and a resume for future domesticity. And then there's handwriting again. Endless copybooks filled with neat rows of phrases like, idleness is a sin, or cleanliness is next to godliness. You're not just learning to write, you're being taught moral lessons one quill scratch at a time. Historians still argue whether Victorian schooling produced true intellectuals or simply obedient clerks. Certainly, great thinkers emerged, but the majority of children were funneled into strict molds. Creativity, if it survived, did so despite the system, not because of it. Joke number 3. If your teacher today complains about messy handwriting, just remember, at least they're not measuring your soul by your cursive. By late morning, your hand aches from quills, your ears ring from recitations, and your back is stiff from perfect posture. You've survived another training ground in the endless rehearsal of Victorian respectability. And when the bell rings, yes, bells dictate everything here, you stand, bow or curtsy, and prepare to step into yet another stage of social performance, the public streets. The classroom door closes behind you, and now the real stage begins, the street. Walking outside in Victorian society isn't just a commute, it's a performance. Every cobblestone under your boots feels like a spotlight. Every stranger's glance like a critique. You don't stroll, you process. Like an actor in a silent play with rules everyone knows but no one dares to write down. First rule, posture again. Yes, even outside, a bent back or swinging arms mark you as careless. Gentlemen keep their strides measured, firm, but not too fast, because rushing looks desperate. Ladies, meanwhile, glide, steps small, skirts controlled, eyes lowered modestly. Joke number 1. A Victorian woman trying to cross the street without tripping over her skirt deserves a medal for acrobatics. Public space is thick with codes. You don't speak too loudly. You don't laugh uproariously unless you're a man among men, and even then. Too much cheer might look crude. Women especially are expected to keep voices soft. Imagine whispering in a library. That's the tone for your entire walk to the market. Here's a strict fact. In London, etiquette books advised men to always walk on the outside of the pavement, nearest the street, so that women didn't risk splashes of mud or, worse, horse manure. A gentleman's role was to act as a shield, even if it meant ruining his boots. Quirky tidbit? Some women carried tiny, muff pistols, small, easily hidden firearms tucked inside their fur muffs or handbags. They weren't common, but the fact that advertisements existed for them tells you how nervous respectable ladies could feel on dark streets. Historians still argue whether public behavior was universally rigid or more relaxed in poorer neighborhoods. Some diaries suggest working-class streets buzzed with banter and song, while middle-class districts demanded hushed propriety. It's likely both. Victorian London wasn't one monolith, but a patchwork of strict codes layered over ordinary chaos. Even greetings are coded. Men tip their hats with a precise gesture, never too extravagant. Women nod slightly or offer the briefest smile. But beware, acknowledging the wrong person can ignite gossip. If a woman greets a man without introduction, tongues wag. If a man ignores a social equal, it's seen as an insult. And then there's the problem of where to look. Staring too long at strangers is rude, but staring at the ground seems weak. The ideal is a calm, neutral gaze, scanning without prying. Joke number 2. In Victorian streets, the original, resting face, wasn't bored or angry, it was carefully respectable. Children in public are policed too. Boys mustn't roughhouse in sight of passers-by. Girls mustn't run or squeal. One misstep and the family reputation is stained. Mothers often remind their daughters to keep gloves on at all times, even while carrying baskets, because bare hands might look indecent. Street etiquette also reveals class. The wealthy stroll in carriages or promenade in parks like Hyde Park, displaying their clothes like walking advertisements of status. The middle class tries to imitate, dressing carefully and following the same rules. The poor, often ignored in etiquette manuals, though the unspoken rule for them is invisibility. Stay out of the way. Don't draw attention, and endure the stares of those who pass by. One strict rule for women: never walk alone at night, unless escorted. To do so is to risk being mistaken for someone immoral. Historians still argue whether this fear was exaggerated or truly dangerous. What's clear is that women's mobility was tightly restricted by social judgment. Then there's transportation. Omnibuses, trains, and cabs are new public spaces that magnify the rules. On a crowded bus, men are expected to give seats to ladies. On a train, talking to strangers is frowned upon. Even how you enter or exit a carriage is policed. You mustn't show too much ankle stepping up, nor shove past anyone rudely. Quirky tidbit: in some etiquette guides, gentlemen were instructed not to smoke pipes on the street while passing ladies, lest the clouds of foul air offend them. Considering Victorian London's air already smelled like coal, manure, and sewage, that's a little ironic. And gossip lurks everywhere. Step into the wrong shop, linger too long in a bookstall, or laugh too loudly at a joke, and someone will carry the story back. Reputations are fragile, and the streets themselves feel like corridors of judgment. Joke number 3. In the Victorian age, you don't need CCTV cameras. You've got Mrs. Peabody across the street, who sees everything and reports it faster than Wi-Fi. By the time you reach your destination, school, office, or market, you've survived another gauntlet. You haven't tripped over your skirts. You haven't laughed too loudly. You haven't acknowledged the wrong person. You've moved through public space as carefully as if you were crossing a stage, bowing invisibly to the audience. And all this, just for a walk down the street. The street is already a stage. But romance? That's an even tighter script. Falling in love in the Victorian world isn't about spontaneity, it's about strategy. Letters, and the constant hovering presence of other people. You don't simply meet someone. You're carefully introduced, observed, and evaluated like an antique vase, valuable if pristine, worthless if chipped. If you're a young man, you can't just stroll up to a woman at a shop and strike up conversation. That would be scandalous. Instead, introductions are made through family friends, church gatherings, or formal visits. Once introduced, every interaction is supervised. A walk in the park? Fine. But only if there's a chaperone hovering a few steps behind, ready to cough loudly if conversation drifts too far into flirtation. For women, the rules are even more suffocating. You don't approach, you wait. A glance across the dance floor, a hand extended for a waltz. That's the acceptable start. Joke number 1. If a Victorian girl ever dared to say, "Hey," first, half the neighborhood would probably faint. Here's a strict fact. Courtship was often conducted by letter. Families monitored the correspondence, sometimes even reading the letters aloud before delivering them. Love notes had to be coded in layers of flowery phrases, because directness was considered crude. Instead of, "I like you," it was, "Your presence brings the warmth of spring to my weary winter heart." If you don't like poetry, tough luck. It's practically the love language here. Quirky tidbit. In some circles, even flowers were used as secret messages. A red rose meant passion, a yellow one meant jealousy, and a sprig of ivy meant fidelity. Imagine trying to decode your crush's bouquet like a spy novel. Did he mean eternal devotion? Or was he just out of violets? Historians still argue whether young people always obeyed these rules. Some evidence suggests that behind closed doors, couples found ways to sneak letters, glances, or even brief touches that broke etiquette. Others argue the rules were so deeply ingrained that most people genuinely believed love had to follow the script. Dances are one of the few socially acceptable arenas for flirtation. But even there, the rules multiply. A gentleman may only dance twice with the same lady at an event. 3 dances would scream serious intentions. Parents and guardians sit at the edge of the room, eyes hawk-like, noting every pairing. A clumsy misstep on the dance floor? It could cost you your reputation as quickly as a bad credit score today. And let's talk about proposals. In modern times, you might pop the question with a ring in a restaurant. Here, a proposal is often less about 2 people and more about 2 families. A man must formally ask the woman's father for permission, sometimes even before confessing his feelings directly to her. Once accepted, the engagement is announced in the newspaper, like a business deal gone public. Joke number 2. In Victorian times, your relationship status update isn't on Facebook, it's in the Times of London. Meanwhile, scandals lurk everywhere. A woman caught in private with a man not her fiancé? Ruin. A gentleman whose love letters are too passionate? Gossip fodder. Courtship is basically a tightrope walk between genuine affection and strict respectability. One strict rule: kisses before marriage? Absolutely not, at least in respectable society. Even holding hands too long could be risky. Couples often relied on the tiniest gestures, passing a glove, dropping a fan, brushing fingertips in a handshake, to carry enormous emotional weight. Whole romances bloomed on nothing more than glances and coded handkerchief signals. Quirky tidbit. Courting chairs existed, 2 seats joined together with a divider, so a couple could sit close while still being proper. It's the original third-wheel furniture design, with the divider standing in for society's watchful eye. Historians still argue whether these elaborate rules made love sweeter or simply more exhausting. Some diaries gush about the thrill of stolen glances. Others read like cries of frustration about endless restrictions. What's clear is that love wasn't a private adventure, it was a public performance, heavily audited by family, neighbors, and even strangers. Joke number 3. In Victorian courtship, playing hard to get wasn't optional, it was basically law. By the time you've survived a season of dances, letters, and carefully monitored walks, you either have a fiancé or reputation for being unmarriageable. And the label, unmarriageable, is more terrifying here than failing an exam, missing a deadline, or even spilling tea at breakfast. So, As the lamps glow in the drawing room and a chaperone pretends not to listen while actually listening to every word. You realize romance in this world isn't about hearts, it's about reputations. Love is allowed, yes, but only in strict doses. Measured out like medicine. Work. The word alone already has a heavy feel in the Victorian world. You wake before dawn, your body half exhausted before the day even begins. And you know what's waiting. A workplace ruled not just by tasks but by an invisible web of hierarchy. Etiquette and expectations. If you're middle or upper class, you might head to an office, a clerk's desk in a counting house, a ledger before you, and a senior manager watching every flick of your pen. Precision matters, but respectability matters more. You must address superiors with proper titles, never interrupt, and stand when they enter. A sneeze without an apology could make you seem uncouth. The workplace is less about the work itself and more about how gracefully you move within its rigid rules. If you're working class, the rhythm is harsher. Factories, mines, textile mills, machines roar, air thick with soot or lint, hours stretching far beyond what a body should endure. But even here, there are unspoken codes. You don't talk back to foremen. You keep your head down. Avoid drawing notice. Being punctual, even if your boots are falling apart, means survival. Mainstream fact. The 19th century saw the rise of the time clock and the obsession with punctuality. Missing a shift or arriving late wasn't just sloppy, it was a moral failing. Evidence you were untrustworthy. The Victorian era practically invented the idea that time is money. Quirky tidbit. Clerks sometimes had to use a special handwriting style called copperplate. So identical that bosses could barely tell one worker's writing from another's. Imagine your boss telling you, your handwriting doesn't look obedient enough. That's a performance review right there. Historians still argue whether strict workplace codes brought order or crushed creativity. Some point to the Victorian office as the birthplace of modern bureaucracy, with its efficiency and record-keeping. Others argue it suffocated individuality, turning humans into cogs long before the phrase, rat race, existed. For women, work carries an extra load of social rules. Middle-class women often worked as governesses, teachers, or shop assistants, and every one of those roles came with moral expectations. A governess had to dress modestly, avoid friendships with servants, and never, ever flirt with male members of the household. Joke number 1. Being a governess was basically like being a family's Wi-Fi. You were there all the time. But no one wanted to notice you unless something broke. Men in offices faced endless little rituals. Hats had to be removed in the presence of superiors. Voices kept low. Jokes only whispered when the manager was safely out of earshot. Lunch was often eaten quickly at the desk or in cramped canteens, with food that was filling but not indulgent, bread, cheese, maybe cold meat. A show of frugality was important. Being too luxurious looked irresponsible. Factories, on the other hand, were their own kingdoms of etiquette. Foremen enforced silence and order, and workers had to follow unwritten rules about where to stand, how to address each other, even when to cough or clear a throat. Step out of line, and you risked not only your job but your place in the fragile social fabric of the workplace. Here's a sharp contrast. Upper-class work sometimes meant nothing more than managing estates or sitting on boards. Yet even these roles were swaddled in ritual. Meetings involved layers of politeness, endless bows to tradition, and carefully phrased disagreements. Directness was considered crass. Better to spend half an hour saying, perhaps we might reconsider, than to just say, no. Quirky tidbit. In some Victorian offices, desks were deliberately placed in straight rows facing supervisors, so the manager could see everyone at once, basically the original open-plan office. Employees even developed signals to pass secret notes or hide mistakes when the boss walked by. Joke number 2. Victorian workers were so good at looking busy. They probably invented Alt-Tab centuries before computers existed, only their version was quickly swapping a novel for a ledger. One more layer of pressure. Appearance. Clothes were uniforms of morality. An office clerk's stiff collar and polished boots announced his respectability. A factory worker's patched trousers marked him as hard-working but humble. A woman with slightly frayed gloves risked whispers about whether her family had fallen. It wasn't just work, it was a daily costume drama, with everyone trying to signal their worthiness. And when promotions or raises came, they weren't always about skill. They could depend on how proper you appeared, how well you embodied the virtues of loyalty, deference, and quiet industry. Joke number 3. In Victorian times, sucking up to the boss wasn't frowned upon, it was practically a job requirement. Historians still argue whether this rigid culture created stability or just masked exploitation. Some say it gave workers a sense of shared values, others see it as a system that dressed oppression in polite clothing. Either way, you're caught in it, whether you're hunched over a ledger or shoveling coal. The rules weigh on you as much as the work itself. By the time you trudge home in the evening, every muscle aching or every nerve frayed, you realize the Victorian workplace wasn't just about earning money. It was about proving, day after day, that you fit inside the rigid box of respectability, no matter how small or uncomfortable that box might be. Evening arrives, and finally you step out of the workplace. The air is cooler, maybe even damp, depending on the season, but there's no escaping the truth. The day isn't done. You're expected to follow just as many rules in leisure as you did in labor. Dinner, visits, amusements, none of it is truly free. It's all watched, judged, measured. If you're from the working class, leisure often means the public house. A pint of beer or ale after a long shift is less indulgence, more survival. But even here, there are social rules. A man mustn't drink too much or risk his reputation as a steady worker. A woman drinking in a pub might be whispered about, unless she's there with family, in which case it's seen as respectable. Even laughter is policed. Too loud, and you're vulgar. Too quiet, and you're unsociable. Mainstream fact: during the Victorian era, public houses and music halls exploded in popularity as spaces where the working class could unwind. But reformers tried to regulate them, pushing for closing times and rules to keep people orderly. Leisure was never entirely free, it was always under someone's thumb. Quirky tidbit: tea gardens and pleasure piers became wildly trendy among the middle classes, with entire families promenading in stiff clothes by the sea. Imagine trying to relax with a cup of tea while wearing a corset so tight you can barely breathe. That's Victorian fun for you. Historians still argue whether Victorian leisure was liberating or just another arena of control. Some say music halls gave the working poor a sense of joy and community. Others argue they were distractions designed to keep people docile. Was a night of cheap laughs at the music hall a tiny rebellion, or just the system's safety valve? Middle and upper classes, meanwhile, had their own rituals. Dinner parties weren't about food. Really, they were performances. Every fork, every phrase, every gesture mattered. Men gathered in smoking rooms after dinner, swapping stories and politics. Women stayed in the parlor, expected to converse sweetly without appearing too clever. Joke number 1. If you ever said something truly witty, you risked being labeled dangerously intellectual, the 19th century version of being unfollowed on Instagram. Games were another staple: whist, charades, lawn tennis. They weren't just amusements but tests of social grace. Winning wasn't everything, losing politely was equally important. The point was to display refinement. No table flipping allowed. And let's not forget theater. Opera houses and playhouses were stratified like mini-societies. The wealthy sat in private boxes, the middle class in the stalls, and the working poor crowded the gallery. But everyone followed the same etiquette: arrive at the proper time, applaud politely, and never embarrass yourself by being too loud. Except, of course, in some rowdier music halls, where audience heckling became an art form. Joke number 2. Victorian hecklers didn't need Twitter, they just yelled insults in real time. And sometimes the actors yelled back. One curious development: leisure also became tied to morality. Reading novels, especially for women, was sometimes viewed with suspicion. Critics claimed novels made people lazy or filled their heads with dangerous fantasies. Yet serialized fiction exploded in popularity, with Charles Dickens practically turning cliffhangers into a national addiction. Families would gather, candles burning low, to read the latest installment aloud together. Appearance was as important in leisure as in labor. A gentleman strolling the park had to wear gloves, carry a cane, and keep his posture immaculate. Ladies wore dresses appropriate to the time of day, lighter fabrics for morning, heavier for evening. Even a walk outdoors was a kind of theater, with passers-by silently scoring your performance. Quirky tidbit. Some seaside resorts offered bathing machines, tiny wooden huts on wheels rolled into the sea, so bathers could enter the water unseen. You'd change inside, step directly into the waves, and emerge without ever scandalizing onlookers with a glimpse of bare skin. Joke number 3. Imagine renting a horse-drawn shed just to get wet. Victorian Uber Eats for seawater. And yet, despite the layers of rules, there was laughter. Music hall songs were cheeky, sometimes bawdy, poking fun at politicians or daily struggles. Families at the fairground shrieked with delight on makeshift rides. Even the rigid promenade walks along piers gave young couples a rare chance to glance, or even brush hands, without scandal. For a moment, rules bent, and life felt lighter, but the weight always returned. Your neighbors might gossip about your drinking. Your children might be judged by the books you let them read. And your very fun might be measured against society's expectations. In the Victorian world, even joy had to be respectable. By the time you crawl into bed, stomach full of bread, meat, or maybe nothing more than tea, you realize leisure didn't mean freedom. It meant another stage, another costume, another chance to prove that you belonged. Dinner is no casual affair. By the time you've been called to the table, you already know the rules are waiting for you like invisible sentinels. Sit upright, don't slouch, don't fidget, and for heaven's sake, don't let your elbows touch the table. Your body becomes a puppet pulled by strings of etiquette. The table itself is a battlefield of cutlery. Forks, knives, spoons, laid out in strict order. From the outside in, you might think it's excessive, but in Victorian society, handling a fork incorrectly could ruin your reputation faster than a bad haircut in high school. Joke number 1. You've never felt true terror until you're holding a fish knife and realize you have no idea what it's for. Mainstream historical fact. Victorian dining followed elaborate rituals, especially in middle and upper class homes. Meals often stretched over multiple courses: soup, fish, meat, vegetables, sweets, each served with its own dedicated utensil. Servants moved quietly around the table, making sure nothing broke the rhythm. Eating wasn't about filling your stomach, it was about displaying refinement. Quirky tidbit. Some etiquette books of the time warned against masticating audibly. Translation: don't chew too loud, or you risk social death. Others reminded diners never to cut lettuce with a knife. Apparently that was barbaric. Imagine someone glaring at you over a salad because you dared to slice a leaf. Historians still argue whether these dining rules were primarily about class distinction or genuine concern for civilized behavior. Was it all an elaborate way for the wealthy to show they were different from the working poor? Or did people truly believe that grace at the table reflected moral virtue? If you're middle class, dinner is both a family event and a training ground. Children are expected to sit in silence, answering only when spoken to, perfecting their manners for the world beyond. A spoon clattered too loudly could earn a lecture on conduct becoming of a gentleman or lady. Joke number 2. Kids these days might get grounded for bad grades. Victorian kids risk shame for scooping soup the wrong direction. Conversation is another minefield. At dinner, you can't talk politics or religion unless everyone present agrees it's proper. You must avoid indelicate topics, which covers anything from bodily functions to money. Women especially are expected to speak lightly, chatter about books, flowers, or weather, never too deep, never too clever. Men dominate the serious discussions, while women prove their worth by appearing attentive but not argumentative. Even laughter must be controlled. A soft chuckle is acceptable, a loud guffaw is disgraceful. You begin to realize that dinner is less about eating and more about rehearsing life under surveillance. Among the wealthy, dining became theater. Guests arrived in their finest clothes. Ladies in silk gowns and jewelry. Men in tailcoats and gleaming boots. The dining room glittered with candlelight reflecting off silver and crystal. But all that beauty came with tension. Place cards ensured strict social ranking. No one could sit above their station. To be seated near the host was an honor, far more important than what you ate. And speaking of food, menus could be elaborate. Turtle soup, roast beef, Game birds, custards, jellies, all arriving in sequence. Servants removed plates with precision, never rushing, never allowing awkward pauses. Imagine being halfway through a pheasant wing and realizing everyone else is done. You're forced to abandon your plate. Dignity intact, hunger unresolved. Quirky tidbit. Victorians also developed bizarre foods shaped into molds. Meat jellies, blancmanges, and even savory aspics appeared on the table, quivering like culinary ghosts. Joke number 3. Nothing says bon appetit like a chicken trapped in lime jello. For the working poor, meals were much simpler: bread, cheese, porridge, maybe a piece of meat if you were lucky. Yet even here, rules applied. Fathers ate first, children last. Silence was often enforced at the table, not from elegance but from authority. Eating was practical, but respect had to be shown. As the meal ended, rituals continued. Men often moved to a separate room to drink brandy or smoke cigars, while women gathered for tea. This division reinforced gender expectations: men in serious talk, women in genteel chatter. If you tried to cross those lines, you'd cause a scandal bigger than spilling soup on the host's rug. Dining, in short, was society on a plate. Every rule, every utensil, every bite carried meaning, and whether you were rich or poor, you never truly escaped the sense that someone was watching, measuring your worth by how you held a fork or folded a napkin. Entertainment should be about joy, right? But in Victorian society, even fun carried invisible strings. You can't simply flop onto the couch with a tub of popcorn in a Marvel movie. Nope. You're entering a world where leisure is monitored, graded, and stamped with approval or disapproval depending on the social class and the setting. Picture yourself in a candlelit drawing room. Velvet curtains pulled tight against the sooty streets. The air smells faintly of coal smoke mixed with perfume. Someone at the piano begins to play, and you're expected to sit up, smile politely, and applaud at exactly the right moments. If you're lucky, the music is decent. If not, well, you still clap. This is Victorian leisure, and personal opinion isn't always welcome. Mainstream historical fact: the Victorians adored theatre. From Shakespeare revivals to brand new melodramas, London's playhouses drew massive crowds. But theatre wasn't just art, it was also moral battleground. Critics argued over which plays uplifted the public and which threatened to corrupt it. Some even thought the popularity of melodrama revealed a dangerous appetite for spectacle. Quirky tidbit. Seances were all the rage. Yes, respectable Victorians dimmed the lamps, held hands, and tried to chat with dead Aunt Mildred. Some swore they heard raps on the table or saw ghostly hands appear. Others suspected trickery, but the seances kept selling out. Imagine today's equivalent being a Netflix seance subscription. Joke number 1. Instead of skip intro, you'd be shouting, skip ghost. If you weren't into ghosts, there were parlor games, charades, blind man's bluff, or the oddly popular Snapdragon, which involved snatching raisins from a bowl of flaming brandy. Historians still argue whether Snapdragon was genuinely fun or just a polite way to set children's sleeves on fire. For the middle classes, reading became a prized pastime. Novels by Dickens, the Brontes, and later Hardy filled shelves. Not only entertaining but teaching morals, or so parents hoped. Lending libraries flourished, and serialized fiction meant you might wait weeks for the next installment, building suspense like a Victorian Netflix cliffhanger. Joke number 2. Imagine waiting 3 months to find out if your favorite character survives, only to discover Dickens killed them off for artistic effect. In upper circles, leisure blurred into performance. Ladies might sing, play piano, or embroider while guests admired their refinement. Men discussed travel, hunting, or science experiments. Amusements weren't just amusements, they were social currency. Demonstrating taste proved you belonged in polite company. Meanwhile, the working poor carved leisure from scraps of time. After grueling hours in factories or mines, entertainment might mean gathering in a pub, listening to folk songs, or watching a street performance. Cricket, boxing, and football grew popular as spectator sports, offering escape from rigid hierarchies, even as they reinforced community bonds. Historians still debate whether the rise of organized sport was a bottom-up movement of the people or a top-down strategy by elites to control leisure time. Another favorite? The Great Exhibition of 1851. Imagine walking through the Crystal Palace, marveling at steam engines, exotic plants, and new inventions. Entertainment and education fused into one spectacle, showing off Britain's industrial might. It wasn't just fun, it was propaganda in glass and iron. At home, board games and puzzles emerged, marketed as improving amusements. Instead of Candyland, you had moral-themed games guiding players toward virtues like honesty and industry. Quirky tidbit. Some games punished players for idleness by sending them back to the start. Joke number 3. It's basically Victorian Monopoly. Except instead of, go to jail, you're told, go repent for your laziness. Even the act of strolling in a park was entertainment, so long as you followed the unspoken codes. You couldn't just wander aimlessly. You had to move gracefully, greet acquaintances, display your best clothing. Hyde Park's Rotten Row became a kind of catwalk, where status was silently announced by the cut of your coat or the shine of your carriage. So whether you were clutching a theater ticket, flipping through a serialized novel, or risking singed eyebrows at Snapdragon, leisure in Victorian England never came free of rules. You laugh, but you also glance over your shoulder. Because even in play, the eyes of society follow. Children, you'd think, get a little more wiggle room in life. But in Victorian England, even the tiniest hands were trained to fold neatly in laps. Even the smallest feet expected to walk with grace. Childhood wasn't some carefree frolic in mud puddles. It was treated as a long rehearsal for the stiff performance of adulthood. Imagine you're about 5 years old, standing in a starched pinafore or a miniature sailor suit, being told not to fidget while company visits. The toys in the corner might beckon, but you already know better than to grab them without permission. One wrong move and you'll earn that dreaded phrase. Children should be seen and not heard. Yes, you exist, but you're more like elegant wallpaper than a participant in family life. Mainstream historical fact. Victorians believed discipline shaped moral character. Corporal punishment, yes, the infamous cane or slipper, was normal at home and at school. Parents justified it as a way to build strong citizens for the empire. Spare the rod, spoil the child. No argument there, at least in their world. Quirky tidbit. Some children's etiquette manuals actually existed, filled with instructions like, do not lick your plate, and never pick your nose before company. Can you picture a 7-year-old solemnly studying a handbook about spoon angles? It's like training your kid with a corporate employee manual. Joke number 1. Welcome to kindergarten orientation. Here's your 40-page compliance packet. Playtime wasn't entirely banned, it was just shaped by rules. Dolls, tin soldiers, hobby horses, and later mechanical toys filled nurseries. But many were meant to educate. Toy kitchens taught girls domestic roles, while model trains and tool sets prepared boys for industry. Historians still argue whether these toys encouraged imagination or simply boxed children into their future roles before they could even spell career. Nurseries often had a strict pecking order too. If your family was wealthy, a nanny ruled your days, with nursemaids assisting. Parents sometimes played a distant role, swooping in for supervised visits but leaving the real raising to hired staff. Middle-class parents were a bit more hands-on, but discipline still held center stage. School wasn't much freer. Lessons drilled in rote memorization, neat handwriting, and recitation. You could spend hours copying lines of moral poetry until your hand cramped. Joke number 2. It's basically, write 100 lines, homework. Except it's your entire school career. Poorer children faced a bleaker reality. Instead of nurseries and dolls, many went to work by age 7 or 8, in textile mills, mines, or as street sellers. For them, the rules of childhood weren't about spoon etiquette, they were about surviving long hours and dangerous conditions. Historians still debate how much the Factory Acts, which gradually restricted child labor, actually improved life versus how much was just public relations. Bedtime rituals could be as stiff as mealtimes. Night prayers were recited carefully, clothes folded neatly, and even lullabies chosen for moral weight. Some nursery rhymes were sanitized to sound less frightening. Others, not so much. Rock-a-bye baby still carried the casual terror of a cradle crashing from a tree. Joke number 3. Imagine telling a Victorian parent, "Actually, maybe we should sing the kids something less apocalypse-themed." And yes, even birthday parties had rules. Children might enjoy a cake or a round of oranges and lemons. But they were carefully watched to ensure no one became too noisy, too greedy, or too wild. Your fun was rationed, measured like sugar in a teacup. So, as a Victorian child, you grew up knowing your every gesture mattered. Even the way you held your spoon or bowed your head at prayer told the world who you were being shaped to become. And while laughter and play did exist, they were always framed by expectation, by the invisible hand that guided you from cradle to adulthood with very little room to wander. You step out into the street, feeling the cobblestones beneath your boots, and instantly you know your place. Not because anyone announces it with trumpets, but because Victorian society is built on invisible barriers, whispered rules, and unspoken hierarchies that wrap around you tighter than any corset. A simple stroll through London or Manchester isn't just walking, it's navigation through layers of class. You can almost feel the air shift as you pass from a poorer district into a wealthier one. The houses suddenly grow taller, the curtains heavier, and even the gas lamps seem to burn with a smug glow. You wouldn't dare tip your hat to someone above your station unless they acknowledged you first. One wrong glance and you're branded impertinent. Joke number 1. Congratulations. You just lost your social credit points before social media even existed. Mainstream historical fact. Victorian England was sharply divided by class. At the top stood the aristocracy and landed gentry. Below them the rising middle class of merchants and professionals. And below that the vast working poor. Even clothing served as a social passport. Silk gowns and tailored frock coats signaled wealth. Coarse wool and patched boots betrayed poverty. You could tell someone's rank before they even opened their mouth. Quirky tidbit. People used calling cards, small, decorated pieces of paper, to announce visits. These weren't just polite notes, they were weapons in a social chess game. A bent corner or folded edge could silently communicate everything from, "We called in person," to, "This is just a courtesy. We don't actually like you." Imagine today's equivalent. Leaving someone a text message where the number of emojis determines whether you truly respect them. Historians still argue whether class boundaries were loosening during the era or hardening in response to industrial change. On one hand, the rising middle class gained wealth and influence, on the other. The aristocracy clung fiercely to traditions, dinners, and land. Either way, you, walking here, know which side of the invisible fence you belong to. Crossing those barriers was perilous. If you were poor and dared to wander too far uptown, you risked police suspicion or icy stares that felt like daggers. Conversely, wealthier folks, slumming it, in poorer areas often treated it like entertainment. They'd take carriage rides just to gawk at the working class. Joke number 2. Victorian poverty tourism, it's like Yelp reviews. But for neighborhoods where you wouldn't actually dare eat the food. Even language betrayed class. Your accent, your choice of words, and even your silence gave you away. The received pronunciation of the educated classes could open doors, while dropping your H's in house or horse could slam them shut. Some families even hired tutors just to polish away working class speech. And then there was the strange etiquette of public spaces. In parks, promenades, or ballrooms, you couldn't simply greet whoever you wished. The higher-ranked person had to acknowledge you first. If they didn't, well, you pretended you hadn't seen them at all. Joke number 3. Basically ghosting. But in real life, and mandatory. Even carriages had seating rules. Certain compartments in trains or opera houses were unofficially reserved for certain classes. You could buy a ticket, but still find yourself unwelcome. Respectability wasn't just about money. It was about knowing where you belonged. And never pretending otherwise. Marriage across classes happened, but it was scandalous enough to fuel gossip columns and novels alike. A wealthy daughter eloping with a clerk? Taboo. A factory owner marrying a governess? Slightly less shocking, but still whispered about for years. Historians still debate whether these unions were rare exceptions or subtle signs of change in rigid Victorian hierarchies. As you continue your walk, You realize that Victorian society is a labyrinth without walls. It's a game of invisible lines drawn across parlors, streets, and even conversations. The trick is knowing those lines so well you never trip over them. Because one wrong step could make you an outcast. Not just for a day, but for a lifetime. You adjust your gloves, glance around, and remind yourself of the most suffocating truth about this society: one mistake, just one slip in behavior, can undo years of careful image building. The Victorians lived under constant surveillance, not by hidden cameras, but by their neighbors, colleagues, and even servants. Scandals didn't just ruin dinner parties, they could ruin lives. It could be as small as the wrong tone in a letter. Write too warmly to someone outside your family, and suddenly your reputation might be questioned. Letters were often read aloud or shared within circles, and gossip spread faster than cholera. Joke number 1. Victorian email leaks, except instead of hackers. It's your Aunt Mildred. Mainstream historical fact. The idea of reputation was central to Victorian culture. For women in particular, chastity and propriety were non-negotiable currencies. A rumor of impropriety could mean exclusion from polite company. For men, honesty in business and dignified public conduct mattered just as much. Losing face wasn't just embarrassing, it could sink entire families socially and financially. Quirky tidbit. Victorians even had scandal sheets, cheap gossip papers filled with anonymous stories of affairs, corruption, and social missteps. Readers devoured them, even though everyone pretended they didn't. Imagine doom scrolling in 1850. Duchess seen at opera without gloves, civilization collapses. Historians still argue whether these scandals reflected genuine moral outrage or were just another form of entertainment in an otherwise repressed society. After all, people who scolded you on Sunday might secretly relish hearing the latest whispers on Monday. Affairs were particularly explosive. A married woman caught in one risked everything: her children, her home, her place in society. Men were more likely to escape with reputations intact, though not always. A politician's slip could cost him his seat, while an aristocrat's dalliance might only add fuel to the gossip mills. The double standard was alive and thriving. Even minor etiquette failures could spiral into scandal. Failing to return a calling card promptly? Social suicide. Wearing last season's dress to a ball? Not exactly front-page news, but definitely whispered about in corners. Joke number 2. Victorian influencers lived in constant fear of being unfollowed at the dance floor. Public trials only amplified the circus. Courtrooms filled with spectators eager to watch high society figures fall from grace. Newspapers covered these cases with lurid detail, and reputations were shredded overnight. A scandal wasn't private, it was a performance everyone paid to see. Of course, rumors could be weaponized. Rivals sometimes spread lies just to undercut someone's standing. And once a stain was on your name, scrubbing it away was nearly impossible. Even if proven innocent, the whisper always lingered, but maybe. Yet scandal didn't only destroy, it also fascinated. Many novels of the time, from Madame Bovary abroad to sensation fiction at home, thrived on tales of hidden sins and public disgrace. It's as if Victorians lived double lives, outwardly stiff and moral, inwardly craving stories of those who broke the rules. Joke number 3. Basically, they invented the guilty pleasure before reality TV came along. As you sit in a dimly lit parlor, you can almost hear the clock tick between silences in conversation. Every word measured, every gesture weighed. The true burden of Victorian society wasn't the corset on your waist or the stiff collar on your neck. It was the invisible pressure to maintain a spotless reputation in a world where one careless misstep could leave you permanently tainted. You close your eyes for a moment, because even the end of the day in Victorian society refuses to let you completely relax. Twilight carries its own rules, its own choreography of restraint and ritual. You slip away from the drawing room, nodding politely, murmuring the right, good evenings, because retiring too abruptly or without notice would seem rude. In your bedroom, the weight of the day lingers like starch in your collar. Before sleep, you're expected to kneel for prayer, or at the very least whisper words of gratitude or repentance. Spiritual routines stitched themselves into nightly closure, because it wasn't just about resting. It was about ending the day in a morally upright state. Mainstream historical fact. Many Victorian families kept devotional books by their bedside, reading passages before extinguishing the lamps. It was part of the culture of self-surveillance and self-improvement. To sleep without reflection was to risk waking morally unprepared. Quirky tidbit. Some households even had bedroom etiquette manuals, yes, literal rules about how to behave when getting ready for bed. They advised against loud yawning, cracking joints, or even speaking too freely once undressed. Apparently, decorum didn't clock out at sundown. Historians still argue whether these nighttime rituals came from deep faith or from the same social anxiety that governed daylight hours. Was it about God, or about the fear of neighbors' judgments carried through thin walls and servants' whispers? Your clothes are another reminder of control. No matter how exhausted you feel, you can't simply flop into bed. You must change into proper night attire, long gowns for women, buttoned nightshirts for men. Loose comfort was acceptable only because it was hidden from society's gaze. Even then, modesty reigned, ankles tucked in, shoulders covered, and then there was the silence. With gas lamps turned low or candles blown out, households hushed themselves into darkness. The quiet wasn't just physical, it was social. Children were expected to sleep obediently without fuss, adults to retire without rowdiness, servants to tread softly on late-night duties. Sleep itself was an act of order. Joke number 1. Imagine trying to sneak a midnight snack in this world. Crumbs in bed weren't just messy. They were practically immoral. You tuck into bed, sheets crisp as if they'd been ironed twice. Maybe you whisper secrets to yourself, because that's the only space where you are free. Yet even here, the ghost of judgment lingers. Tomorrow, the performance resumes, and every small detail will once again be measured against the invisible ledger of Victorian respectability. Joke number 2. It's like living in a 24/7 audition. Accept the role as acceptable human being. The fire dims, shadows crawl across the patterned wallpaper, and you drift into half-dreams. Perhaps you imagine slipping into a world without corsets, without chaperones, without neighbors peeking through curtains. That dream will vanish with the morning, of course, but here, just for a while, you can let go. Joke number 3. Unless, of course, you snore. In that case, even your sleep gets a bad review. The truth is, Victorian life wrapped you in rules from dawn to dusk, and even beyond. You went to bed not just as yourself, but as a carefully sculpted image of propriety. Tomorrow would ask you to do it all again. And now, as the last echoes of Victorian footsteps fade, you can let yourself loosen. You don't need to hold your posture, or worry about which fork to use, or whether your collar is starched enough for society's approval. All of that can fall away now, like layers of fabric slipping gently to the floor. Take a slow breath, feeling your chest rise and soften. Exhale, and let the weight of rules and judgment drift with it. In the hush of this moment, you are safe from curious eyes and wagging tongues. There are no gossip sheets here, no stern etiquette guides waiting on the nightstand, just the quiet of your own space. You can imagine the lamps dimming in those endless drawing rooms, the streets outside emptying of carriages, the last notes of the piano fading from a parlor where every note once mattered so much. And now, silence, the kind of silence that belongs not to society, but to you. Your body settles deeper, like it's sinking into something soft and timeless. You may notice your shoulders release, your breath slowing, your eyelids growing heavier. There's nothing left to perform, nothing left to prove. Let your mind drift where it wants, through candlelight, or cobblestone streets, or simply into darkness. Wherever it goes, it's carrying you toward rest, not judgment. And as you float further, remember this: you're no longer under Victorian eyes. Tonight, you belong only to yourself. Sweet dreams.